All right. Yes, but I can't see you if you want to speak. So, but we're a small group, so just jump in. But if you raise your hand, I will not be able to see you. Okay, because it's a window and not the whole screen. Um, all right. So I think the first Mishnah or two that we're looking at. We may have actually done last spring, but that's okay. Um, so where it says Hu Haya Omer, he used to say the he is actually is Rabbi Akiva. Okay, we have several Mishnayot that are quoting statements attributed to Rabbi Akiva. Um, we'll start with 14. Um, Hu Haya Omer, he used to say, Haviv Adam Shenivra V'Tzelem. So, beloved is the human being because he was created in the image. But B'Tselem is short for B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So human beings are beloved because we were created in the divine image.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So I missed the last session of last year, but can we go back to the prior one? I have a question about that. Just to the
Uh,
about the abstinence. That's it.
yeah. Okay.
So my question is this a good translation? Because to me, this would make a lot more sense if it says excessive merriment and frivolity, accustomed one to sensual licentiousness. Merriment and frivolity is a part of the human condition, is a part of who we are. And
Right.
I just think that's overly.
All right. Well, Kalut Rosh literally means lightheadedness. Not, I mean, is lightheadedness the same as frivolity? I don't know, but I mean, it's not just having fun, okay? It's worse than that, okay? It's really, because I think if you think about, I mean, frivolous. I mean, I think there. If I think of the word frivolous, there are two different meanings, right? There's frivolous meaning just it's not something important, right? Like I don't know. Kelly and I like to watch Love Is Blind, right? I mean, that's frivolous, but it's not really harmful. Although, there is certainly this idea in more traditional circles of bitul Torah, meaning spending time on frivolous pursuits that would be better spent studying Torah, right? But then there's, frivolity, which is really more, it's not quite licentiousness, but it's almost bordering on licentiousness, right? But the word here that they translate as abstinence is pre-shoot, and that really means like separation. Okay, so now in the Haggadah, there is a phrase "prishut derech eretz," which means literally like sexual abstinence, but it's enforced sexual abstinence. In other words, Pharaoh would keep the men and the women separate. I mean, there's nothing in the Torah that says it, but this is in the Haggadah that Pharaoh would keep men and women separate so that they couldn't have sex, so that there wouldn't be, more Hebrew babies. born. And then when that didn't work, when the men and the women found ways to be together anyway, that's when he started killing the male children instead. But like the word Pharisees, right, which is a complicated word because we see it, we see it through the um, through the lens of we'll go back to the text, but it's easier if I can see you all. When we hear the word Pharisees, right, we see it through the lens of the Gospels, where it's like a negative, right? But as I often say to Christian friends who will, give sermons against the Pharisees, and meaning well, but that's really anti-Judaism, right? Because the people that you call the Pharisees, we call our sages of blessed memory. But the word Pharisees comes from the Hebrew prushim, which is the same root, prishut. Okay, prushim. Why were they called prushim? Because they, so some of the criticism of Jesus is based in, the reality of Second Temple life. In other words, Jesus ate with tax collectors. Jesus ate with common people. Why was that scandalous? Because the Pharisees, and it only makes sense to be scandalous if Jesus is a Pharisee. They did not eat with the common people because the common people were not careful about ritual purity. They were not careful about tithes, etc. Okay, so the Prushim were those who separated themselves from the common folk. Okay, so in that sense, what does it say? So nidarim sayag leprishut. Okay, so vows are a fence to abstinence. Okay, not abstinence is not a bad translation, but by abstinence it doesn't mean simply. First of all, I don't think it means celibacy, right? I think it means faithfulness in marriage or celibacy outside of marriage. Um, but it also means other things like, one of the, and it's a very, very hard tractate, so I don't know very much about it, right? But the Pharisees made a really big deal about untithed produce. Okay, so if you had a vow, so there was three categories of produce, right? Produce that was definitely tithed, produce that was definitely known to not be tithed, and then there's demai, which is like we're not sure if it was tithed or not. Okay, so the Pharisees would be very careful. They would abstain even from demai, from produce that they were not sure whether it had been tithed or not tithed. Okay, so I think that would help you to avoid the things that, as a good Pharisee, you should be avoiding anyway. Right? Is that helpful?
It is helpful, but you said that instead of frivolity, it can mean lightheaded, which to me would mean someone that drinks too much. And that would make sense in the first sentence. And I'm not going to keep going on about this, my semantic problems. But if you're lightheaded, if you drink too much, certainly that would be over the line, and it could lead to licentiousness and
Sure.
sexual immorality. But otherwise, merriment and some frivolity is part of who we are. We as human beings, and it gives us a personality. Otherwise, we're clods.
Right. I mean, but you also have to look at the historic context. Okay. I
Yeah.
mean, Akiva is living in the generation right after, or maybe two generations after the destruction of the temple. And in fact, he was killed during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135 CE. Um, so, they felt, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, you may have known Holocaust survivors who felt that any sort of merriment was out of bounds. Right? After what I've been through, and you're going to laugh, and so I think, that could have been true of Rabbi Akiva as well. I mean, he was living in that generation after the destruction of the temple. Um, I mean, and look, this literature is multivalent. I mean, there were certainly sages who were opposed to essentially any sort of enjoyment, right? But then there were others who said that, you're going to have to account for God, to the things that God created, that you are legitimately allowed to enjoy, that you chose not to. So, Akiva probably was more towards the first tendency than the second.
Thank you for going back. I
Sure.
apologize for holding
No,
this up.
no, that's fine. I mean, we're here to learn. We're not, not to cover certain amount of material. So, um, anyway, so human beings are beloved because we were created in a divine image. It's extra, more especially beloved, in that it was made known to us that we are created in the divine image. Um, as it says in Genesis 9:6, He b'tselem Elohim asa et hadam, because God created um, human beings in the divine image. I think it's worth pointing out here that it talks about humanity being created in the divine image, and not simply Jews being created in the divine image, right? And that, I think, is really important. I mean, I know certainly, for me, one of the things that has been really strongly motivating me these last 10 months or so is the idea that things are being done in our country that do not respect the divine image. And they're not being done, by and large, not being done to Jews, but that doesn't mean that it's not a Jewish issue, because Judaism teaches that we were all created in the divine image. But I've spoken, I mean, even on Yom Kippur, about this, not even a tension really, because it's not a tension, but there's two aspects. There is universalism and particularism, right? So the first, stick, if you will, of this Mishnah talks about human beings being created in the divine image. So that's the universalistic, right? Um, and then the rest of it is particularist, right? Havivin Yisrael, Israel is beloved because they were called children of God. And then it's extra beloved that we were known, that it was made known to us that we were called children of God, as it is said in Deuteronomy, Banim atem la'Adonai Elohechem, you are children of Adonai your God. And then the last part, Havivin Yisrael she'nitan lahem klei hemda. So Israel is beloved because a precious vessel was given to them. What is that precious vessel? The Torah. And then we're extra beloved because we were known, it was made known to us that this beloved, this precious vessel, was given to us, Shebo Nivra Ha'olam, that by means of this precious vessel, the world was created, as it is says, Ki lekach tov natati lechem torati al tazovu, I give you good instruction, do not forsake my teaching. Right? But what, and I know I've mentioned this before, but there is this idea, right? It says, so it was made known to us that God gave us this vessel through which the world was created. Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? I mean, obviously, he's talking about the Torah, but what does it mean here? What does Rabbi Akiva mean when he says we were given this goodly vessel through which the world was created, or by means of which the world was created? There's this rabbinic idea of, and I spoke about this a little bit during when we read Parashat Bereshit at the beginning of this cycle. All right, that is in Rashi, but it's not original to Rashi. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And he breaks up the word bereshit, which is a grammatical impossibility otherwise. Bereshit, with reshit, and then there's somewhere else where the Torah is called reshit chokhmah, the beginning of wisdom. All right, so essentially, to not get too bogged down, that statement means that the world was created with or by means of the Torah. In other words, it's the rabbinic doctrine of the pre-existing Torah, okay, which we find echoes of in the Gospel of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. In other words, the Torah existed before the creation of the world. And in fact, not only did it exist before the creation of the world, it is the blueprint for the world. Okay, how did God know how to create the world? Histakla v'oraita uvara alma. God looked in the Torah and created the world. Right? It's like, God didn't have he didn't have a smartphone, right? Like if I'm cooking something, like I have no head to remember recipes. I look and I type in and I find the recipe, and that's how I know how to cook whatever I'm cooking, right? So God, like, well, what's the recipe for creating the universe? Ah, it's the Torah. So he looked in the Torah and created the world, right? So that's what that statement is saying, that we were
Are you
given this.
suggesting, does that suggest that everything that's in the Torah was predetermined? Because the Torah is a series of parshiot, of the adventures, essentially, the history, one week at a time, of from creation until the end, and with certain laws and rules and wisdom in between. But it's not just black letter law. It's a history book in many ways.
Right. I'm not sure that when Rabbi Akiva is talking about the Torah, that he means the history so much as he means the ethos. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, and in another mission or two, we get to um, everything is foreseen, yet free will is given, right? And so, I mean, you get hooked up, you get bogged down in certain questions of things that would otherwise be logical impossibilities, right? Um because again, there's a rabbinic statement that the patriarchs knew the entire Torah. Okay, so then if the patriarchs knew the entire Torah, then why didn't Jacob warn Joseph not to antagonize his brothers? Right? Because he knew what would happen, because he knew the whole Torah, right? Or, like, more poignantly, um, if you accept the traditional understanding that revelation was quite literal, from God to Moses, right? So Moses is receiving the whole Torah. How does the Torah end? With the death of Moses, right? So Moses is receiving the narration of his own death, right? So then there's some kind of, well, okay, so it all except the last chapter. And then the last chapter was actually given to Joshua, not Moses, right? But I think, look, the word Torah is very elastic, right? It's extremely elastic. And the Torah means the Pentateuch in this context, but it means much more than the Pentateuch as well, right? It's the whole corpus of Jewish wisdom, right? So, in that sense, Pirkei Avot is part of the Torah also, even though it's certainly not part of the Pentateuch.
Why would God have to look in the Torah to see how the world should be created? Didn't he write the Torah? Isn't he the author of it? If he's not, who is?
Yeah, I have no answer for that. I mean, although I don't know, I mean, do you ever find yourself writing things down so that you'll remember them even though you know them? Right? Yeah.
Yes, but I'm not God. I don't think he would forget what he wrote.
All right, but you have, I mean, you have to understand that, well, you don't have to, but the God of the Pentateuch is not the God of the philosophers. Okay, if we look at um the so Parashat Noah, right? So God says, I mean, in that parasha, God twice learns and admits to making mistakes, right? God says, you know what? I really regret having created humanity, right? I really regret having created humanity, so I'm going to wipe them out, all except Noah and his family, right? Now, if God is omniscient, what? How is God saying, I regret having created humanity? Right? God didn't know how it would turn out, right? But God obviously didn't know how it would turn out. So God is bummed that, this species that he created turned out badly. So, and he said, I mean, he says that specifically, Nichamti ki asitim, right? I regret that I made them, right? That's not just reading into it, that's explicit. I regret that I made them, right? How can a perfect omniscient being have regret? Well, but the God in the Torah has regret. I regret having created humanity. Okay, so he wipes them all out. And then after that, he says, shouldn't have done that, right? Because that's just the way they are. That's just the way they are. And so I shouldn't have done that. So I'm never going to do it again, right? And so I promise never to do that again. And as a result, I'm going to create this thing and I'll put it up in the sky, rainbow, and I'll put it up in the sky and I'll remind myself that I promised not to wipe out humanity again. Right? So that it's not a perfect being that has perfect omniscient foreknowledge. Because if it does, then the whole story of Noah doesn't make any sense. Because
Rabbi,
God,
go
yeah,
ahead.
good. No, go on, go ahead.
To start with, the Torah has gone through a few different languages. And when that happens, inevitably, there are slips. One word might mean something to somebody in context, but now we interpret it entirely differently.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Hebrew text. I'm not talking
I
about,
appreciate that.
yeah.
It could
But
be.
then,
Go
Wait.
but
ahead.
then beyond that, this text, however we want to see it came about, and it could have been divine in spirit, but this text is through the prism of man's people, of humans, um, intellect. And so the inconsistencies and the explanations very well can be because that's the way the interpreter, who had the best of intentions, but this was the interpreter's idea, the being that wrote this, not the supreme being, but the person that brought it down to us, the Prometheus, if you will, from the heavens. And I think that's where we get into a problem with these sorts of interpretations sometimes. I think that all of them are wonderful in a metaphorical sense, and there are great lessons to learn. But I think that the underlying part of the Torah is one thing, and I think that's what you're talking about. But the history of the Jewish people, the the HBO special that we have every week is very different.
Right. I don't disagree with you, but okay, and here's the where I don't disagree with you, and then here's the but. Okay, in other words, to me, my Judaism does not rise or fall on direct verbal revelation. Okay, by any stretch of the imagination. If you want to say that these ideas and these stories were passed down, through generations until they were written down much later, I have no problem with that. Here's the but. The but is that nevertheless there are still different layers, right? That the Philo or the Maimonides who insist that God is the unmoved mover and has perfect omniscience and so on and so forth, that God is still not the same God as the God that's in Genesis. Wherever that Genesis idea comes from, whether that comes directly from God or whether it's divine refracted through a human prism or even totally made up by human beings, the point is there are still different layers. That's what I'm saying. And I think part of the problem is that, and I'm not casting blame, right? I mean, I spent 5 years studying this stuff, full time, and then I get paid to study it, right? In the same way that it's if I come to you with a legal question and you say, well, you don't really understand it, blah 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 blah, you're not being critical of me, right? It's your job to know that in depth, right? It's not my job to know that in depth. But we just don't. And then, unfortunately, and I really say that, and this really is our fault, is that the most accessible stuff that you find on the web comes from a perspective that does not acknowledge history, and that Judaism fell pristinely from the sky and there is no development, no change, no human influence whatsoever. And we just have not developed accessible materials from our perspective as our friends at Chabad and Aish have, from a very different perspective. Yeah. Leslie, you had something that you wanted to, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, since the Torah was given to the people, it seems like it would be written in a way that people could identify with it, and people make mistakes, and maybe it wasn't really trying to say that God made a mistake, but it was just trying to teach us that we will make mistakes, and or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's what makes it accessible, right? Is that we can sort of see ourselves in those narratives, right? And there is absolutely an explicit rabbinic statement that Torah speaks in humanly accessible language, right? I mean, as an example, when it says in the Torah, the hand of God. Okay, like even the most literal people don't really believe that when the Torah says the hand of God, it means God has a hand like this, right? Or where it says in the Torah, you should circumcise your heart, not talking surgery, right? So there are certainly other places where, yeah, that's explicitly understood that it's metaphorical. So here, yeah, absolutely could be just, accessible. It still doesn't really explain, though, the idea of why God would go through this whole rigmarole of creating and then destroying humanity if God already knew that, like, we would turn out that way. I mean, that doesn't. So, again, it's like, I agree, but yeah. All right. Anybody else? All right. If not, we'll go on. Okay. So, yes, the next Mishnah, all right, is very, very, I get hung up on this. You may or may not, right? Hakol tsafui v'harashut nituna. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted, right? And so, right? So that's what it says, right? That right? If God is omniscient, then God sees the future, and part of God seeing the future is knowing the decisions that we will make, right? And Leslie, I definitely remember that we got into this in the spring, and that's fine. But if God knows the decisions that we make, then I
wait
think
a minute. You just said if God knows the decisions that we make. That's where we have the free will to make our decision. Just because he knows what we're going to do doesn't mean he made us do it. It's two different things completely.
I don't see it that way.
No.
I don't see it that way. That if God knows the decision that I'm going to make, then I have no opportunity to not make that decision. And if I have no opportunity to not make that decision, I don't have free will.
Well, what if, for example, if you and Kelly are trying to make a decision and she knows what decision you're going to make. It doesn't mean she made you decide that, but she knows what you're going to, it's two different things.
Well, all right, but sometimes she knows, but I surprise her. Or I know, but she surprises me, right? It's not the same thing, but I can't surprise God, right? God can surprise me, but I can't surprise God.
Well, because he knows what's in your heart before, he already knows the decision that you are going to make. He didn't cause you to make that decision. He knows what decision you're going to make, but he didn't cause you to make that decision. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it that way. I mean, I just, somebody else want to weigh in here? Yeah, Sue, go ahead.
Well, I see what Leslie's saying, and I agree with her. But I also wonder, could it mean that God sees the outcome of any decision that we might make rather than knowing what decision we're making, that he knows the outcome whatever decision that we make?
Huh. I can live with that, and that makes sense to me. Absolutely, right? I mean, yeah, if X then Y, right? If Y then Z, right? I mean, right, we make the decision, but God knows God knows the outcome, of the myriad of possible decisions that we could make. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I was looking at in preparation for the class tonight, in Bartanur's commentary, and so Bartanur is quoting Maimonides, so I didn't see Maimonides' statement himself, but Maimonides basically says that you shouldn't say what I just said, okay? But he simply asserts it to not be a contradiction. He doesn't explain how it's not a contradiction. Which again, I mean, that is the realm of religion. I mean, like, look, if you look at the official normative Christian teaching about the nature of Jesus, right, which most Christians either don't know or don't really believe, right, but that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, right? And from a Jewish perspective, that's just absurd. I mean, you're a human being or you're divine, right? And so most Christians, if you push them, they'll say, well, wasn't really human. He just kind of looked human. He kind of had a body, but he was really God, right? But that's not what the teaching is. The teaching is 100% human, therefore subject to all of the temptations and so on and so forth that human beings are, but yet he was also God. And so, you push them, and then first it's the mystery of faith. The mystery of faith. Okay, mystery of faith, fine. Means I have no good answer. I simply assert it to be the case. Yeah.
Except that in the human condition, we have times when we're demons, and then there are heroes. There are people that go selfless, people that do incredible heroic acts under different circumstances, and depending on what you call a hero, but that is of the divine. That is, we talk about Alvino Macanu, and it's, you're dealing with your father, the person, the being that can understand that you might make this decision, but hopes that then the person can grow from it and be a better person and become more toward the divine than the base human.
Right. But that's not the Christian doctrine. Okay. I mean, do we all look? I mean, to get back, right? We were created in the image of God, right? Now, what does that mean? Right? It obviously doesn't mean that we look like God because God has no body, right? It means that we have elements of godliness in us. But elements of godliness in us is not the same thing as being fully divine. Right. And so, I mean, I haven't gotten into this kind of discussion in a long while, basically ever since, we now have a Ring camera. So when somebody knocks on the door, I know who it is. Right. So if it's the Mormons or if it's the Jehovah's Witnesses, I no longer answer the door. I might one day if I'm in the mood for a little fun, right? Because say, yeah, of course Jesus was the Son of God. Oh, well, yeah, and like so am I, and so are you, right? Oh, that's not what we mean. Right. In other words, it's not the same thing, right? It's not a difference of degree. It's a difference of kind, right? And so, but it comes down to simply, like I say, the mystery of faith. What is the mystery of faith? The mystery of faith means I can't, there is no way to explain it logically because it is illogical, but nevertheless, I assert that it's the case. And that's fine. And that's absolutely fine. I just want you to acknowledge that that's what you're doing. That's all. I mean, and so to me, I mean, if you want to assert, I mean, look, obviously Rabbi Akiva asserted it. He was a lot smarter than I am, right? And he was a martyr to the Romans, right? Maimonides was a lot smarter than I am. There are a lot of people throughout the centuries who are a lot smarter than I am, who assert that it's not a contradiction. Okay, fine. I respectfully disagree, but that doesn't mean it's not the normative teaching. All right. Go on. All right. Uvetov ha'olam nidon, the world is judged with goodness, which I think means that God sort of gives us the benefit of the doubt, right? Or, in baseball terms, the tie goes to the runner. V'hakol lefi rov ha'ma'aseh. Everything is in accordance with the preponderance of the works, which the commentators basically say that each person has a propensity to act according to the evil inclination or act according to the good inclination, right? Like everybody, right? And right, it's sort of a normative Jewish teaching that we are created with a Yetzer Hatov and a Yetzer Hara, a good inclination and an evil inclination, right? And nobody is 100% evil or 100% good, with the possible exception of Stephen Miller. But having said that, right? So you could be a person whose Yetzer Hara, whose evil inclination is predominant, and yet you are capable of doing good things, right? You could be a person whose good inclination is predominant, and yet you are capable of doing bad things, right? Because we're all human beings, but we do generally act in accordance with our predominant inclination, right? I mean, there is, and I don't know if this is a real Native American proverb or a Native American proverb made up by some white guy, right? But this guy is talking to his son. He says, I've got two wolves inside me, right? The wolf that attack is the attack wolf and the protective wolf, right? And well, which wolf is stronger? The one I feed, right? And so we right, and because otherwise, right, to get us back to the question of do we have free choice, right? If we don't have free choice, then it doesn't, then if we don't have free choice, then the whole Torah is really a waste, because the Torah is a system for cultivating virtue, right? And if and the existence of a system for cultivating virtue presupposes the possibility of acting virtuously, right? And if you don't have that possibility, then there's, there's no point. But if that's the case, then it's also unjust for God to hold us to account if we don't have the possibility of, behaving according to our own free will, right?
Yeah, but
I
from
agree
our
with you.
perspective, from our perspective, we have to believe that we have free will. Otherwise, why would anybody ever be punished for stealing or for killing or for any of that? Your Honor, it was predetermined. I couldn't help it. That doesn't work. And juries don't buy that.
Right.
And
Although
most judges don't.
right. Although
And the reason,
sometimes,
yeah, the reason is that we are here on earth. And so, from our perspective, you are responsible for your actions. And to us, the Torah sets out a set of guidelines, some stories that we can pay attention to, some black letter law to that extent that says this is what you should do. And then we can try to fill in with our own intelligence, our own rationality, why that makes sense.
right, but sometimes you really don't have any choice, right? But then you're
Right.
not held, but that's the insanity defense, right? That's
Oh,
the
you know,
insanity. But that, look, okay, but you have to really convince the jury that that's the case, right? But the law contemplates that sometimes it might really be the case that you have no free choice, in which case society can protect itself from you by isolating you and optimally trying to treat you, but that's not supposed to be punitive. It's supposed to be protective, right?
but that's our laws here in the United States. In
Right.
many places, they don't have an insanity defense, I believe. And throughout ages, there were obviously people that we could all argue were absolutely insane, and they were executed or whatever
Right.
because they committed what were then considered to be crimes.
Right. Joe, you had something that you wanted
Yeah,
to
no,
say?
I think this second sentence is key because if 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 judging the world favorably depends on preponderance of good deeds, and it ties in with our freedom of choice, I think. Yeah, we have the freedom to do good deeds, and then the world
Right.
would be judged favorably.
Right. Right. Exactly. And it's, it's not an expectation that you're going to be perfect, right? It's an expectation that you're going to be, it's the preponderance of the evidence, right? It's not beyond a reasonable doubt, right? It's the standard is a civil standard. It's not a criminal standard, right? But which is also something that Christians misunderstand about Judaism, right? Is that, well, how did, you commit transgressions and you need the blood atonement and da 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 da. It's not, you know, that may be what you think Judaism teaches, but it's not what Judaism teaches, right? God understands that we're gonna make mistakes, and God doesn't hold us to a standard of perfection. It's just a standard of,
More often
more
than
good
not.
than bad. Yeah. All right. Okay. I'm not sure that it makes sense to start the next Mishnah because it's a long one, and while obviously we have to we have to stop, like, in mid discussion. I don't think it makes sense to stop in mid Mishnah. So I think we'll call it an evening. And so next week we're back to Psalms. And so, we got halfway through 118, which is the last Psalm in Hallel. So if we finish 118 and still have enough time that it makes sense to do so, I think it makes sense. I don't know. I'm not sure whether to do the daily. You know what? Let's do the Kabbalat Shabbat Psalms, because I think people encounter them more frequently than the daily Psalms. And once we do Kabbalat Shabbat, then we'll do the daily. We'll do the daily Psalms. Okay. All right. Good night. Thank you, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Night.
you.
Shabbat
Thank you
Shalom.
for
Good night.
doing,
Shabbat
for doing
Shabbat Shalom.
the
Pleasure.
service tonight.
Thanks.